Tax reform, Obamacare subsidies, immigration, and now maybe NAFTA. Congress has a long agenda to address, and key to sorting it all out is Senator Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania, who sits on both the Senate Budget and Finance Committees. We welcome him now back to the program from the Russell Rotunda on Capitol Hill. Welcome back to the program, Senator. And
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I really want to focus in on tax reform because that is what our audience is particularly concerned with. These other things can be distractions. But the president has just tweeted out the following, quote, Republicans are going for the big budget approval today, first step toward massive tax cuts. I think we have the votes, but who knows? So that's the president. Give us a sense. Do you think you do have the votes? I think specifically, I think he's talking about the budget resolution today.
Yes, I think we do have the votes. I'm actually pretty confident that we do. We will fend off many amendments today that are designed to destroy this process. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to pass a budget resolution in the Senate. Now, keep in mind, the House has already passed their version, which is quite different. We have to reconcile that, and then both houses have to pass a reconciled version. But as you know, this is an absolutely necessary precondition to tax reform because the budget resolution allows subsequent tax reform to pass the Senate with a simple majority vote. And we have to assume that we will need that 50-vote threshold in order to get this done. So, big day today. Certainly not the end of the process, but a really important milestone.
Well, give us a sense of the next step of the process. How long would you expect that reconciliation to take so you have one bill that's agreed to by the two houses?
Good question. Yeah, I think that'll happen next week. I think over the course of next week, representatives from the House and the Senate will come together, work this out, and hopefully be able to get it resolved and then get it back out on both chambers' floors for up or down votes. So that could be a bit of a challenge because the two versions are quite different, but it's not as though we haven't seen this coming. So there's been a lot of discussion, there's been a lot of work. I'm cautiously optimistic we get that done next week. And meanwhile, of course, by the way, tax reform is proceeding on a parallel track. It can't actually happen unless and until the budget resolution passes, but we are in the process of developing the legislation so that we'll be ready to go quickly as soon as we have this procedural tool.
Okay, so not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but let's assume you get all that taken care of on the budget resolution. You're ready to go forward with tax reform. As you look at the substance of tax reform, what do you see as the big 2 or 3 hurdles to getting to an agreement on tax reform?
Well, look, any number of hurdles could come up along the way, but here are the big features that I think are going to make this a compelling package. One is there's absolutely going to be a net tax reduction for middle income and lower income working families. So that's absolutely going to happen, and that's a hard thing to vote against. Secondly, we're going to make sure we make reforms on the business side that make America more competitive. It's going to be very pro-growth. Dramatically lower corporate tax rate from the 35%, virtually the highest in the world, down to, I think, 20%, and full expensing of capital expenditures, which is very, very pro-growth. Those are the kind of linchpins. And then finally, fixing the international piece that has left so much overseas subsidiary profits stranded overseas. Those are the big things. And, you know, if we do that right, I think it's going to be pretty compelling.
As you go into this process, Senator, will you be watching, will the Congress be watching the distribution of taxes across the various income levels? You mentioned middle-class tax cuts. Right now, the numbers are, I think, something like 10% of the people in America pay 80% of the taxes. Is it your goal to maintain that ratio?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because this is one of the problems we have with our Democratic colleagues. Despite the fact that 10% of the people pay 80% of the taxes, they're insisting that the people who pay the vast bulk of the taxes must get no savings whatsoever. And I think that's just a ridiculous criteria. What I want to do is absolutely make sure that working class and middle income families get a savings. And then I want a tax code that maximizes growth. So if that means that virtually everyone has some savings, I'm fine with that. You know, we'll have to look at the distribution, certainly, but I think inevitably very wealthy people are going to continue to pay a disproportionate burden of the total tax load. I mean, that's very likely to remain the case. But the important thing is a net tax reduction for virtually everyone I think people should be quite happy with that.
So finally, Senator, as I mentioned, there are quite a few other things you have up there on your platter right now. And address a couple of them. Could they really derail or really postpone tax reform? And specifically, the wall and immigration on the one hand, and the subsidies for Obamacare health care insurance. Could they really stop this?
I really think they can't. I think those are discrete issues. They're very separate. I mean, later this week, actually, probably tonight, we might very well pass a supplemental that will address the crisis in Puerto Rico. We will do some of those things as we go through this process. Other things like dealing with an infrastructure bill will await the completion of tax reform. So, no, I think this is our priority. We are all focused on it like a laser. There is complete unanimity, I can tell you that, among Republican senators, that it's really important that we get this done. So I don't think we're going to let other things derail it.
Senator Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania. Thank you, Senator, very much for joining us today.
All right, thanks for having me.
John